Hello, everyone. My name is Monica Lynn James, your friendly neighborhood art teacher. And today I want to talk about a topic that's not so friendly. It's actually a very difficult topic and something that we are seeing the effects of right now happening all across the world. And that's cultural domination, specifically how it affects institutions of art and what those are and what that looks like. And I just want you to be a little mindful before we dive into the topic that this is a very difficult, challenging, and emotional topic, and just to please be mindful of your emotional response. Getting into some of this material may trigger some things for you, and I just want you to be mindful of that and your self care following that. And please share any questions or comments that you have with me on in that respect, especially. So with that, we're going to dive into cultural domination within the institutions of art. Let's switch over to the slides. The objective of the mini lecture is to understand how cultural domination lies at the root of institutional racism. To understand institutionalized racism and how it affects the institutions of the United States, in order to analyze and identify issues related to diversity. I would like for everyone to learn about the legacy of racism that lives within every country touched by colonial empires and how it affects a variety of cultures across the globe. You should be able to apply skills learned and knowledge gained in order to make real significant cultural change and to help to create a more just and equal society for everyone. I hope that we can all create a better world than the one that we inherited. There's some shared vocabulary that I want to go over with you so that we all have the same foundation and background knowledge. The first is cultural heritage. It's often confused with race, but cultural heritage is a shared bond and belonging to a community with history and shared traditions that link people to the past, present, and future. Think of cultures like art and food and many different traditions which we share and pass down from generation to generation. Oh, and also language as well. The next term is imperialism, which is the imposition of a politically or economically dominant culture of various aspects of its own culture over another. If you like science fiction, think about the Borg, where resistance is futile and you will be assimilated. So that would be the most extreme example or science fiction example. And then we come to race, which is truthfully a social construct, even though many of us have learned very different things in our K-12 or previous experiences learning history. Many of the things that we're learning we are deconstructing and reanalyzing, rethinking today. But now we know that we are truly all part of the human race, and scientifically, there are no genes that define quote unquote race. The word was first used in the 16th century in the English language and became widely used during the 18th century to sort and rank people in the English colonies. So that's the true history of the word race. Identity consists of experience, value, and perspectives that create our sense of self. And of course, all of that is influenced by our cultural heritage, how we experienced imperialism, and how we are defined by race. So how are race and culture different? What is our role and identity today, and how is it affected by all of that? How is identity impacted by these issues of race and culture? Just think on those things. You can even jot them down and come back to them later. That's a much deeper, longer response. So you can just kind of jot that down to think over. The connection. What's the connection between this and art? Institutional racism is the impact of white supremacy on the institutions of society. So what are some of these institutions? Before we get into art, what is really institutionalized racism? So Some of the institutions that we think about are schools, the legal system, healthcare, government, agriculture, and food systems, and that's just a few. There are many more. Can you think of ways these institutions are impacted? And how does this affect your life today? In art history, we see many impacts of racism, stereotypes, and cultural domination. Racism definitely had an impact on institutions of art history. Some of those institutions could be art museums, art schools, textbooks, art history textbooks. And here's an example from art history. One of the first textbooks created on the topic of art history actually established the idea that white is a color of purity, sublime beauty, and superiority. Published in 1764, the history of the art of antiquity was written by J.J. Winckelmann and would go on to influence art history for the next few centuries. In art today, and even in art history, we see many tangible visual examples of culture and many examples of cultural domination through suppression of art and culture. Think about the things we don't see, or it might be things that have a negative label or negative connotation. When I was a student, my first art history textbook, published and written by Jansen, considered the chapters on African art and indigenous art were entitled primitive. And I remember feeling very hurt and immediately struck with the negative connotations of that word primitive, and often engaging in debate with my professor in the class on how a primitive art form could inspire modern art. There's many examples. Just a few years ago in the news, we saw the destruction of the Burmese Buddhas by ISIS. In the news media all the time, we see in music videos, fashion, the runway, TV, media and fashion, we see all sorts of examples of cultural misappropriation. And there's a very fine line between appreciation and misappropriation. One example would be some of the runway shows which use Native American and indigenous headdress and spiritual regalia as fashion. We can also take a look at Native American culture here in the United States and the inability to practice religion, which was not abolished until 1978 by the American Indian Religious Freedom Act. So up until that time, people were prosecuted, even sent to jail, if they were caught practicing their indigenous religion. Now, there's many other examples of either the suppression of art and culture or the labeling of art and culture in negative connotations, attaching stereotypes, negative stereotypes. But there are also examples of cultural heroes, both today and through art history. Artists, historians who sought to preserve cultural traditions which may have been destroyed or lost. I think about the recent protest against in Standing Rock, where indigenous peoples were fighting against a gas pipeline which was slated to go through sacred ground, traditional sacred ground. I also think of the 1920s and 30s when artists of the Harlem Renaissance sought to combat racism with positive images of African Americans in their artwork. There's organizations very active today, like the Global Heritage Fund, UNESCO, and the United Nations, which are funding and working to preserve historic sites which are in danger of destruction. And there's many, many more. If you're in my class, you get to kind of dig into these ideas and connect with them personally. And what I'd like for you to do is to find that personal connection, whether it's within your own cultural heritage or something that you've seen in the news today that just really gets your gut, or something in history that you connect to, or something new that you learned in this class. And just before I forget, to dig in deeper, I've included my citations, which have some very interesting articles and some of the references that I used to put together this presentation. So it's a great place to start if you want to learn more about this topic. So I hope that some of the things that I've shared with you will help us to maybe undo and deconstruct some of the negative heritage of our past, so that we can really fully reclaim our shared history and start to look at that in a more holistic perspective to help us move into a better future. Thank you so much. This is Monica. I hope to see you soon.